morning, everyone, and welcome to our final episode in our partnership series for 2023. It's been an absolute privilege to bring you some insights from some great partners during the year. And we are going to finish off with a bit of a banger. Asset finance is certainly on the tip of everyone's tongue, and we're all very excited to see what happens in 2024. Please remember today that you are welcome to use the chat or the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. If we find that we've got the right time, we'll pop the question in there and then. Otherwise, we'll save them all to the end. But please make sure you do use that chat function, because today we are extremely lucky for our final episode to be joined by James Slattery, who, yes, is one of the three brothers who are the owners of Slattery Auctions and Valuations. And James's role is predominantly to look after the valuation side of the business. James, welcome to the Early Pay Partnership Series.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
We're pretty stoked to have you. I've been looking through your market overview over the last week or two in preparation for our webinar. So I think we're going to have some great bite-sized pieces of information for our brokers. And we've got a few clients actually on this call today as well. So I think we'll start straight off with just that general overview of the market for 2023. Can you just share for us what you've seen this year, and obviously highlight some of those key points in some of those key industries?
Yeah, I just want to get back to your introduction, and I'm from an auction company, and you said we're finished with a banger, and I was thinking, D's part-time humour jokes out there. That's fantastic.
Not quite. It's a good topic, mate. I like this one. I like talking about what's happening and, forecasting for next year. I think it adds lots of value. And as I said, there's some really good information in the overview, so I'm hoping we can highlight that today.
Yeah, well, it's a good question around what's happening for this year. So if we talk about the calendar year, the very first half of the year has been very different to the second half. So what we're seeing in the auction business, so we've got sites all around the country, and what we've seen is it was harder to get equipment to sell from January through to May, but something changed in June, and you'd go, end of financial year or whatever it was, but it was just this big influx of equipment to sell. So we had one of the best months we've ever had in June, and that was through a number of different reasons. So we sell for a lot of what we call the SME market, or the corporate market, where it is, from someone who's got 5 trucks all the way up to a fleet of truck who's turning over 50 trucks a year and those sorts of things. And ever since, it has just been a really strong market for selling things. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that has happened, because a lot of it's all sort of anecdotal, unless you get sort of major data trends. Is there seems to be, at the end of the mining boom, right? And, there's places like Emerald, and there'd be a property that was worth $5 million, and then the end of the property boom, went back to being worth $500,000, and they said, I should have sold it, and whatever. And everyone sort of knows those stories, particularly if you've got the background into those sorts of industries. And I think at the beginning of the year and last year, everyone was holding on to equipment because they didn't want to miss a contract or whatnot. This year, I think people have gone, you know what, I don't want to miss the market, and I'm going to sell it early. And so I think that's played a part to it. They haven't been able to get staff, so now they're selling equipment more and more, which is leading to a lot more transactions, and obviously linked in with newer equipment becoming available. Things that have been on order for 2 years are now turning up. Yeah. For some reason, I can't hear.
I hit the mute button. I thought you were going to keep going, but I think one of the things that's really interesting, James, and I'd be interested to see where you have seen that shift this year. Supply chain obviously was huge during COVID, lots of supply chain issues. How have you seen that sort of play out in 2023, and where do you see it moving forward for next year?
The supply chain is, so we break it down into the different segments, right? And so if you look at transport, particularly trucks, so prime movers, they're still out till 2025. So anything that is, or even longer now, but there is a bit of a normalisation in that market. But if you've got used or second-hand trucks that are less than 500,000 kilometres, then they're still selling extremely well. Even trucks which have got sort of between 800,000 to 1.1, 1.2 million are still selling okay. Like, that's normally the market which suffers the most when things normalise. And there has been a bit of a normalisation across the market, but they're still holding up pretty well. And that's because new supply is restricted. If you go into the trailer market, and that's where you segment the transport much more specifically than just a prime mover, because a prime mover can work across a number of different sectors. But the trailers, they've been sort of readily available for some time, and they're depending on specific trailer requirements, but they're still selling reasonably well. So there is supply chain which has been corrected. This might be getting in a little bit too detailed, but with the long forecasted dry spell, which doesn't feel like the case now that we've had lots of rain, but for what is meant to be a long period of dry spell, we're expecting that come March or April, that there is going to be a lot of grain tippers or grain specific type setups that are going to start to suffer a little bit more. And so that is potentially an oversupply. And that happens with the agri sort of assets, where if the weather's not right, farmers grow very short arms and very long pockets, and they don't spend their money. And a lot of that equipment will come to market. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the rain, because the current rainfall, particularly on the East Coast, has been very good, and it's happening at the right time. So we'll just see what happens with the summer crops.
Yeah, we've certainly been lucky with what we expected to be dry from, November all the way through. We've had, certainly here being based in Queensland, we've had some great Queensland, storms and a bit of prolonged rain that we weren't expecting. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. What are some of the other industry-specific trends that you've seen this year?
I think there's definitely an increase in excavators coming onto the market, and certainly that sort of 20 tonne and below. And so there's a lot more availability. You can go and buy, say, a 13.5 to 18 tonne machine, and that's pretty easy at the moment. So there's been quite a number of sales that have been happening. And I've seen just probably in the last couple of weeks what it is, and this is going to use a real corporate buzzword, which is there seems to be people that are right-sizing their companies, which is they've struggled with staff for a long time. They've sort of gone through the growth period of the last couple of years where people just needed work. It didn't matter what the cost or whatever. They just put people in where they could, and they weren't necessarily good operators or whatever. And so particularly in that civil space, particularly around the housing development with a slowdown there, anything that's geared up to that, I think people have gone, you know what, I don't actually want to have the stress, and I'm going to shrink the business down to a point which I'm just happy and profitability is going to be good. I don't need the stress leading into Christmas. And so I've actually seen a couple of examples of that across New South Wales and Victoria at the moment. And that's what we get told. We don't obviously know the financial situation that sits in behind that, and whether interest rates are biting or whatnot. But there seems to be a lot more in that civil space, which is becoming available. So there's either pain through not having operators, or the interest rates are starting to bite, because you can't, unless you've got the machines, you can't have a contract, and typically there's finance attached to that, and then obviously the price of diesel. But the operators are also very hard to come by, particularly good ones.
And how are you seeing that, I guess, in the mining sector? Same?
Mining's, there's two parts. There's the direct mining houses, and they're performing really well and making record profits. The ability to churn out cash is unbelievable. But the mining services guys, they're the ones which the mines get really good at running very lean, and so they run lean, particularly through low price cycles. And then what used to happen is everyone used to get fat. So there was this upward trend of mining services companies doing really well off the back of the mining companies. But I don't think it's really happened in this cycle. I think the mines have sort of kept a lid on their costs and stopped their contractors from from reaping the same benefits that they are, and that is going to really show in probably when there's a more of a normalisation in the commodity prices, particularly coal. Those mining contractors will suffer. So there's already been some pretty well publicised major mining contractors which have either gone into administration or are looking at trying to get finance or whatever it happens to be, and I think that trend will continue. But overall, there is some pretty healthy signs for the mines, and if you're a good contractor and you've got a good relationship with the mining house, then I think you're fine.
And while we're talking about that, again, when I was reading through your report, we've got Volvo and Hitachi in that civil and earth moving space that are sort of, launching hybrid and fuel efficient machinery. We spoke before we started about ESG, so that environmental, social and governance. How big an impact have you seen any of that impact already, and do you expect that to have a fairly big impact on the sector?
Yeah, I think it's probably the biggest opportunity for not just the brokers and financiers, but also for their clients. So anyone who's sort of proactive in that space, you'll be well ahead of the curve. So there's a number of manufacturers that are bringing out either hybrids or electrics or whatever, depending on the size range of machinery. And what that'll lead to is the client who's buying the machines and tendering for the work, they will be looked upon more favourably by whoever the head contractor is, and depending on who's ultimately paying the bill, so whether it's a government project or whatnot. And given that we're going through another infrastructure boom, that is going to be very, very, very prevalent. So anyone who's being able to demonstrate that they can do the machines that have got a lower emission than, say, a competitor, they will be looked very favourably upon. The secondary benefit is that a lot of financial institutions are now offering sort of green funding. So what you do is you get to win work and lower your operating costs. So, it's kind of like the perfect business model. Like if you can do it, it just makes sense. Whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, the economics are really starting to stack up. And that's always been the argument for a long time. Unless it's economic to do it, why would people? But the way that they'll force them is by giving the work to the operators who can do it.
Correct. And certainly in a couple of discussions I've had, some of the transport guys are looking now, when they're looking to replace their fleet, they're trying to sort of start to balance up those numbers and bring in some more low emission or more fuel efficient vehicles now in preparation. And a lot of the smaller players or the newer players to market have really got their finger on the pulse, because they do see that opportunity that you just spoke about. It's really hard to turn a 300-400 fleet into an ESG compliant type fleet, right? So the smaller guys have got a little bit more opportunity to be a bit more pliable and ready.
Yeah, that's right. And even the big players, if you go back to transport, so the new Team Global Express, which is the old toll, which was bought by Allegro from Japan Post, they have just put in and this is again well publicised, they've just bought a whole a section of their fleet, which is all targeted zero emission vehicles. So they will, they're very proactive and they're very, very savvy operators. They will be able to win tenders that their competitors won't, and that's purely based on the fact that they'll have this section of their fleet that is all EV.
Brilliant. For brokers and for business owners that are on today, if you haven't got your finger on the pulse around ESG at the moment, certainly I recommend that you do, because there's going to be, as James said, an opportunity to win business that you may not have been considered for before. And again, you're right, this green pricing, we've seen it over the years. Not that electricity prices are something we're all jumping up and down happily about at the moment, but again, it's a very similar path, just on a much larger scale. The more green you are, the less it's going to cost. James, I'm really interested to say, sorry, go.
Oh, I just wanted to make a point, because there will be people who will say, oh, well, it can't happen, or it's still too expensive. And there's an element of that is true. If you go out to buy, say, 10 trucks, how do you charge it? And we were at a recent session with Daimler, and they've got an electric, their EV for their trucks, their EV division, and they've had to install a substation which was, it's not completely connected, and it's upwards of six figures already. And so, you've got the trucks plus you've got this additional cost to go, all right, well, what's that look like? And that is all just part of that decision-making matrix, right? To go, well, what is the return on that investment? And the investment isn't just the 10 trucks, it's also a substation or a charging station or finding a new property or whatever, which is, they're all really hard things to solve. But this is about the people that are willing to be proactive, and I'm sure there's brokers out there that know how to finance a substation.
Absolutely. I'm interested too. Obviously, we've always in lots of things here in Australia, received the sort of backlash or the whitewash from things that happen overseas. What sort of international economic shifts, and events are impacting our local markets right now?
Oh, there's obviously heaps, right? Everyone saw the supply chain issues, so you get some geopolitical risks, and that plays a massive market. Australia is, our total population is the size of a megacity, but we've got so much land, so all we get allocated is what we're told. We don't get to demand anything. It's just this is your allocation for whatever it happens to be. And at the moment, you put in an order for whether it's a large Caterpillar bulldozer or mining truck or whatever, and all you get given is a slot. And then closer to delivery time, that's when you'll get the price. So those things are massive. When you, even if it's a manufacturing equipment, it's all dependent on the dollar and shipping and all those things. So a lot of that stuff is just completely outside of our control. And I'm still a firm believer that Australia just seems to be charged the Australia tax, and because we're over here and we don't have lots of options, we just have to pay whatever the price is. I know that there was one OEM who could buy machines from a different jurisdiction cheaper than what he could from the manufacturer who supplied him, and which is just incredible. But that's just the way it works.
Yeah, and how I guess can, from your experience, how can brokers help their clients to, reduce that disruption to their business when they're looking to purchase equipment?
I suppose it kind of depends on what sort of industry the client's in. I mean, first of all, they're all welcome just to ring me and say, hey, what do you think? And that's easy. But I think it's probably trying to work out with the client what direction they're taking the business in, and if there is any opportunities in that ESG to say, hey, have you considered this? Because this is going to be massive. If you want me to help you get better rates on your financing deals, this is something that you need to consider. And so with the interest rates doing what they are, then people will obviously be looking to reduce their operating costs, and that's just an easy way. And then most brokers have decent relationships with different dealers, whether it be equipment or trucks or whatever anyway, and just talking to them to find out what's around, because what I think is happening is there is more cancelled orders around, and if you're ready to go and you've got cash, it is still king. And people will sell you things quickly and easily if you're available and you're ready to transact.
Absolutely, and I think there's a fair bit of future planning, because of delivery times as well. Is that what's sort of helping keep the secondhand market in Australia strong? The fact that we have to wait so long for new pieces, so everyone's trying to source where that secondhand piece of equipment is?
Yeah, I mean, there is more of a normalising market, and I'm really interested to see what happens after April and particularly Easter, because that's when the weather starts to turn and the consumer spending, whether it's a pair of board shorts or whatever, it also still affects cars and trucks and other purchasing. Like it's the behavioural science that sits behind it, and so I think that things are going to be relatively strong, particularly through this summer period. There's a lot of business confidence. We're selling lots of equipment at the moment, and we're working on a number of transactions in the valuations business as far as M&A and those things. So there is still a lot of deals and confidence in the business sector. But I'm just interested to see what happens when the weather starts to turn.
Absolutely. I want to dive in for a little bit around, we spoke about some of the international economic shifts and how that impacts us. But if we're looking at, how the economic factors influence supply and demand of quality equipment, I'd love for you to chat to me about, we've got labour shortages driving demand, for quality equipment. We've got, all the different ways that supply has increased. Can you just talk us through, what you've seen, what you know, and what you predict to come in that space?
Oh, dust off the crystal ball and solve all the economic issues. Oh, wow.
We're all going to hold it to you, mate. We're going to hold it to you too. I'm going to get you back next year in about May and say, right, so here's your prediction. Let's replay it.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. We should definitely do that. I think people are being driven to be more innovative. There's with unemployment at 3.6% or something. What that means is you can't get good people. So what's the solution? And whether that is tech, a tech solution to try and reduce whatever. Be it AI, Chat GPT, we run a Salesforce platform, and Salesforce is now starting to push AI down to us to say, all right, well, can you, how can you guys apply this? So those things that you just sort of have to look at it. So I think there's going to be forced innovation, and with that will become productivity. So the productivity rates, I think, are going to also force decisions from businesses to go, all right, well, this is just not sustainable. We're either going to right size or we're going to scale up. And so I think that sort of mid-tier of business is going to suffer. I don't really, as far as the industry specifics go, there's been, if you talk about transport, it's sort of highly segmented. So there's, I think it's like 20,000 transport businesses in the country. That always is going to be the case, I think, because people can't necessarily scale up or down easily with that. It comes with a lot of risk. They seem to get to a point and they either continue and go really well, or they get to a point and they explode and they go insolvent. And then it sort of goes back down into another 10 or so businesses, and then different people build it back up and whatnot. So I think that will always be the case. The transport or the freight task is just so massive that everyone has what typically seems to be a 30 to 50% exposure, or all financiers into transport. So that's just kind of a massive staple. So when it comes to earth moving, I think that the second half of next year is when people will get to, or the middle of next year to the second half of next year is when the housing box will come back, and that will increase demand again, particularly, as I said, for that sub 20 tonne type market. I think that's going to be really popular. You look at the housing shortage, and that means that the equipment has to be used. There just isn't any other way to try and solve that demand. I think the labour costs are going to scarily go up, because with just the construction requirement and even the infrastructure spend by the state and federal governments is just so massive that unemployment isn't going to come down anytime soon.
No, I agree. What financial challenges have you seen sort of emerge this year, with the state of the market?
A large part of our business is geared up towards insolvency and insolvency practitioners. So it is returning to that insolvency market, and insolvency appointments nationally are returning to their long-term average. So over COVID, most people are pretty well versed in they were at historic lows, and now they're returning to their the levels that they should be. They're not elevated above the long-term average. So that's sort of somewhat surprising. You would think that with the amount of zombie companies and higher, or what is perceived to be higher enforcement rates, but the big four banks are actually really good as far as enforcement. They're more willing to work with the customers. So the biggest driver of insolvency is most likely going to be the ATO, and the ATO most people would have seen or had some experience in this through their clients. is that if they're not paying their super guarantees, so the ATO are massive on protecting the staff, they're not paying super guarantees, or they're not communicating, then they're getting some pretty nasty letters from the ATO, and that is going to lead to more enforcement. However, if you're engaging with the ATO and you're doing what you say, they seem to be working with people, but they're also taking a more hardline approach than what they have over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and look, we've spoken about that recently in our last series with Olga from Tax Assure, and she's the same. And you know, that piece is all about if you're talking, if you're communicating, if you're doing what you say with the ATO, then they're really open to longer arrangements and longer terms to help support that business. But you know, if you're burying your head in the sand, they're very, very quick to pull the trigger at the moment, and quite aggressive in that space. And I guess that's what makes it hard when we talk about the big four, is that, you know, we're hearing the same sentiment that they're a lot more open to working with these businesses. But the minute you've got the ATO in there calling in, you know, hardcore debt, it becomes difficult for the banks. And so for us, from, you know, as you know, we write EF, but our predominant business is invoice finance, and we're starting to really see an increase in invoice finance inquiries now, because customers are good, clients are good, you know, debtors are strong, but cash flow is getting really tight. And whether you're right, all those things we've spoken about already so far, whether it's interest rates, whether it's cost of employment, cost of, you know, goods and equipment, we're sort of starting to see that increase as well. And you know, obviously we work on lots of things together. That insolvency space, are you seeing any I guess typical industries, or are you seeing an influx in any particular industry as to others with what you're dealing with?
Well, again, it's more sort of anecdotal, with the exception of construction. Yeah. So again, very well publicised, but we're still dealing with lots of construction companies that don't hit the news. So we're finalising quite a large one at the moment. However, there is still plenty of construction which is keeping the insolvency practitioners busy, as well as even the auction houses. So I think that is, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And you think surely we're going to run out of builders, but similar to transport, they sort of pop up and they start all over again, and you can get some scale pretty quickly. The trouble is, if you've got 15 projects on the go and one or two of them you get the estimations wrong, then that's enough to sink the business. I've just recently met with a business in Queensland, and they've got really strong, invested really well in their estimators and their and even their operators, but they've underinvested in their accountants, so they're winning work, but their back office team aren't providing the accurate figures for them to go and tender with real numbers. So they're sort of behind the eight ball. So they're working on a bit of gut feel, and they've had a couple of contracts not go their way. And so we're looking at, again, helping them right-size their business so that they can exit certain things, get some cash flow, and then start to rebuild. And I think there's going to be more of that, just some consequences from the low unemployment rate. So you just sort of hire someone to fill a role, and then the problems come out later.
Do you think this right-sizing will see, an influx of new businesses being registered as well?
Yeah, probably. One thing I don't think Australia does particularly well is pricing risk. I think we go, oh, it'll be right. Yeah, probably will be, but what if it's not? And so that's where to have major companies brought down by one or two contracts is, but we're also think that we're a competitive nation, so no one likes to lose. And so we go in and so I think there'll be plenty of that sort of behaviour happening where people go, oh, well, I'll just go and start this. And they'll win a couple of contracts because it's hard to get good people.
Yeah.
It's just whether those businesses are scalable becomes the challenge.
Yeah, of course. And certainly we see that a lot in that transport and logistics type area where they've been a driver and then they go out and they set up their own ABN and, they want to have a crack at it at themselves. And I think that's one of the things around, talking about with the ESG stuff. If you're in a position where you can start planning for this now and you're a small operator, it's really going to give you the opportunity to tender for some bigger jobs or more stable contracts where there's going to be an ESG requirement moving forward. What are the industries to watch for next year? Where do you see the most movement?
Well, transport's always a favourite. I mean, you can't not look at that. And so I think that's going to continue to be a really big driver as far as the ESG and the electrification of trucks. There's a lot going to come out of China. So the technology which we see in Australia isn't what's available globally, and so we will see a lot more, and it will happen very quickly as the product out of China gets better and more available over there. It will then become available here through different brands. So I think what we'll see is more dealerships, or the dealerships will start to change a bit like the way that the Japanese cars used to be. That's what's going to happen with the Chinese cars. So you're seeing the likes of the Great Wall, so GWM, then a few of the others, which are MG and the likes, are coming out with a lot more electric type cars, and I think that's going to just scale up into trucks. So Photon are starting to get a pretty big presence. So I think that's what we'll see over even the next 12 or 24 months, is a change in the brands that we're used to. Surprisingly, Toyota haven't come out with a full EV car, given their history in Prius. So they're more going down the hydrogen route. So that's going to be interesting to watch that play out. There's obviously some famous Australian billionaires who are really pushing the hydrogen barrow. And so the hydrogen superhighway, which is coming down the east coast, I think that's going to be interesting. It's part of that infrastructure pipeline. What else do we think is going to happen next year? Agri is certainly one to watch, particularly given the long-range dry forecasts of the weather pattern. So that is due for a bit of an overcorrection. I started off COVID by saying all the Collins Street and Pitt Street farmers who have gone out, and it's never been a better time to be a farmer in Australia over the last 3 years, where you could buy land reasonably cheaply compared to now. You could buy stock it with cheap cattle and sheep and whatnot. But when the weather turns, and you can fly back to Europe, what's going to happen with the city-based farmers who want to go on European holiday, but they've got to pay 20 grand a week to feed their animals? That's going to be interesting. There's already stories in Western New South Wales of farmers shooting calves and things like that. So I think that's abated somewhat due to weather, but agri is definitely one to watch.
And what assets, we just got a question in there, what agri assets do you think will be affected, like the yellow goods or the transport side, or?
I think definitely transport. There's a lot of agri type businesses which probably be classed as say a transport business, but they're carting grain. So those ones will definitely be affected. It really depends on the operator, and that's mainly around whether the yellow goods on the farms. They're normally quite old anyway. You don't normally go and see a farmer go and buy farming is broken up into corporate and then family operations. So you don't see too many family operations, and even some of the corporate operations, going out and buying brand new, say D8 or D9 to go and clear their dams or whatever. They use contractors to do that sort of thing. So they might not use the contractors as much. And so just trying to reduce that fixed cost of running the farm. So the yellow gear that is owned by the farms, it normally stays there. They just park it up and it doesn't really matter. So it comes at a low cost base. So what we have seen is some of the big four banks go to work with the farmers, and what they'll say is, if you want to borrow an extra couple of $1 million to go and sow a crop or whatnot, you've got 10 tractors. You don't really need 10 tractors, so why don't you sell 5? And so there's and then we will co-invest. So that money, you don't have to give it back to us. We'll let you use that, and we will add to that so that you can sow your crops and try and get an income out of that. So there's been a little bit more proactivity with in those things. As far as the assets, If it is a dry season, then the headers and the grain type assets specifically will all be quite cheap, and that's when you get the bargain hunters come out.
Yeah, okay. And more, I guess, from, we've touched on sort of agri and mining and transport. What about civil? Where do you see that, and obviously supply and demand in that civil space? What are some of the things to watch out for in 2024 with civil?
Oh, well, the federal government cutting a lot of projects. That's been interesting to watch. I don't think they can cut too much more. So I think that there's going to be relatively strong. The civil guys that do the sort of the housing development type blocks, that's sort of slowed up. However, with the housing shortage, the likes of Stocklands and those guys, they will still be doing developments and major land plays. So I think that will be relatively okay. I don't think there's anything major. Whenever mining's strong, then the mining contractors stay in the mining contracting space and the civil guys stay in the civil space. If that drops, then they sort of start to play in both and try and drop down into a different sort of market, which doesn't always necessarily work well, but people will always try and survive. So I think it'll be relatively strong. I think the prices will hold up. There'll be some ebbs and flow as far as whether things are selling well or not at the time. And I've mentioned a couple of times that sub 20 tonne, it's sort of doing a little bit tough, but over that is still going quite well.
Yeah, perfect. We've touched on obviously a lot of commercial industry today, but I'm keen to hear too about what you've seen happen with just consumer automotive this year, and where you see some of the biggest changes in consumer automotive in 2024 as well, because obviously our brokers that are with us today do both, and a lot of them buy their own, we've all got our own vehicles, etc. So I'm pretty keen to hear what you've seen and what you expect to see moving forward.
Yeah, sure. So clearance rates have steadily decreased over the last 2 years, or from 2 years ago to now, and that's kind of to be expected because no one could get a car where now you can. So, and it's more sort of normalised, but I think that anything that is relatively late model is still selling really well. So if you look at the auction profile of cars, and I stole a slide off one of the fleet management organisations, and it had, and it was focused primarily, or what I focused on primarily was cars that are 18 months or less, 18 months old or less, that went to auction, and it started in about 2003. And it's decreased to a point that it's almost zero, or very, very low numbers. And part of the reason was, particularly governments and local council, they would have this program where they would sell cars at 1 year or 20,000 Ks, and then that sort of slowly blown out. So now it's kind of 3 years, 80,000 Ks. So you're not getting this regular turnover of that sort of government fleet, which used to be there. The government fleets are still there. It's just not at the same level that it was. And so that was sort of all brought about by trying to be responsible to ratepayers and taxpayers and whatnot. But it's actually done a bit of a disservice. It was more around perception management. What they didn't want is people in the council driving around in, say, an SS Ute, for instance, even though they had a better residual value than driving around in the poverty pack. So the ratepayers went, oh, it's better that you drive around the poverty pack, even though they got a lower return on that particular car. Yeah. And so they just extended that out to go, all right, well, instead of turning it over at 20,000 Ks, we'll run it to 80,000. And so what that means is that profile of less than 12 months old, that normally comes through repossessed vehicles. And over the last 3 years, the amount of repossessions has just been incredibly low, if not next to nothing. The only time that particularly a big four bank would repossess would be if someone handed it back. The OEMs, they were a little bit different. They would, some of them took the opinion of, well, if they're not paying for their loan in COVID when you're at home and not doing those things, then we know where the car is because it's under lockdown. We'll just turn up and take your car and sell it. And if you look at the prices over the last 3 years, was actually a disservice by the councils and the government to not do it at 20,000 Ks. But you can't change that quickly, right? To try and get cars. So most people have the story that they bought a car and sold it for a profit during COVID. Those times I think are over.
Yeah, absolutely. And are you starting to see those, vows start to drop down? I mean, from personal experience, you buy a secondhand Prado and was still worth more than what we bought it for 2 years ago. But now when you start to Google those things on car sales and bits and pieces, you're starting to see that drop back to, or as you would say, normalising. Are we expecting to see that across all ranges in automotive?
It depends on the model. So there's some models which still have really long wait times. So if you own a hybrid RAV4, for instance, you will probably sell it for more than what you paid. So that's because it's a 2-year wait. If, however, and this is what I particularly love, is you order a car and you say, oh, how long is it going to take? And they say, oh, 6 months. And you go, is that real? And you go, yeah, it's real. You're like, well, what about the price? Can we negotiate on the price? No, you can't negotiate. It's 6 months. And then you get a phone call sort of about a month later, and it says, oh, we've got a cancelled order. Do you want it now? And so that order book is, I think, just a really good sales tactic. And again, a lot of the brokers will have a relationship with different dealers because everyone wants a car, and they normal phone call to the dealer, I need this car, and they can sort of cut through a lot of the rubbish that the dealers are letting people believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I wrap up with the last question, so I'll just throw it out to all of our viewers that are on today. Now's the time to hit up the Q&A if there's anything that you'd like me to ask James specifically. But I mean, you've been really generous with obviously the insights and the things that that you've seen this year, and COVID's been in a really interesting, space. And this year we've started to see, the effects of COVID normalise, although we've got thousands of people running around Queensland with COVID at the moment. But I'm really keen to see where you think the biggest areas of growth will be in 2024. I know we've spoken about, we've got to wait till Easter time from sort of that agri-farming type. But is there anything that you are like, oh, I'm really watching this space, I'm really interested to see what happens next year?
I'm not any more than normal. I think the times are a little bit different. I like to watch when the transport market really corrects, and so, but I don't see that happening because not for some time, just because the availability of new stock just isn't there. So if that changes, that'll be really, really interesting to watch. But I think it's not necessarily a particular industry segment that I'm watching to go, oh, well, that's going to be interesting. It's more around the different styles of management, which are going to be interesting across any different sector. So if management isn't proactive in talking to their clients and readjusting rates and those things, which are all really hard conversations, you kind of got to roll the dice to say, hey, you need to pay me more, or the only thing worse than an underperforming supplier is an insolvent one. And so that's where those things. So management needs to be really strong, particularly over the next little period. Otherwise, they will just get left behind, and that they will become one of the growing statistics of increasing in insolvency numbers. So I don't think there's a particular trend. When things get tough, people also get tough and go, all right, well, we need to survive, and people will adapt and do those things. And we've seen that most people are pretty good at that over the last couple of years. But I also think there is going to be the part where where again, management will say, you know what? And it's been happening a lot anyway, just going, in that baby boomer bracket, and they go, well, I'm either going to sell or I'm just going to exit. And so I think there's going to be plenty of activity around that. So if the brokers have got proactive management to go out and strategically buy their competitors, I think there'll be lots of that happening.
Yeah. I've got a question here, and I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit, but it's around valuations and saying, we've seen things sort of level out a little bit in general automotive. But are you seeing any rapid decreasing in valuations in certain sectors or types of equipment or machinery, etc.?
No, not rapid. I mean, there's normalising to go, all right, well, things aren't as easy, and we've spoken about this as a business to say, well, salespeople in that equipment and even the auction houses got sort of a little bit fat and lazy, I think, because we didn't have to really work that hard over the last 2 years. All you had to say is, oh, we've got this here, and it'd sell for above what it should have. So now we have to be a little bit more proactive. So we're definitely talking to our team about actively selling things again, and there is a return to that. So I don't think that things are going to fall off a cliff. I don't think that's the case, but there is. It will take things just a little bit longer to sell. We ran quite a large clearing sale for a farm in central Queensland, and we got market value for a lot of that equipment. But that was just because it was really good equipment in the right location. It just took extra time. And so if it was, say, an unreserved just sell, it potentially could have been a bloodbath. But we were working with the client there to make sure that the prices were maintained throughout the whole program, and that was sort of a just shy of $5 million as far as a clearing sale.
And I think that's key. Is that the maintenance of that fleet of trucks or machinery or whatever it is, the better maintained these pieces of equipment are, then there is more likelihood to achieve market value still today. The old fire sales sort of terminology doesn't seem to be thrown around as much anymore as what it used to be.
So there is one of those things where anytime you go to buy something, it's about removal of doubt. And so if you've got a good maintenance program, you've got good I suppose, aesthetics of the equipment, if there is just confidence in the fact that you've looked after, you've maintained it, and it's a good piece of equipment, then someone will always pay a premium. And they just, that's more, again, that behavioural science is to say, and we actively say to clients, and even just yesterday I was with someone and they said, oh, I'll just touch it up. And I went, no, don't touch it up. People will be more confident if they can see that there is a bump or a scratch or whatever it happens to be, because they know that should be there. If it's hidden, then they wonder what else is hidden, and they actually pay a lower amount for it. So, we always ask for the maintenance histories if we can get our hands on it. So I think where that is the case, particularly with companies that are well known, because people know whether someone maintains their gear or not because they see it around the sites. We actually, this, just to indulge me a little bit, we had a Ferrari we had to sell. This was years ago, so I'll be a little bit more candid about it. We had to sell this Ferrari, and it was from Queensland, and everyone in Queensland knew that it had just been flogged by the guy who owned it, and it got repossessed, and it would have sold for less in Queensland just because the perception was that it had been driven really hard, and that the repairs and things. We got it checked out. They said no, it's fine. Anyway, and it ended up selling in Sydney through a different provider. But that was just one where you just went, oh, that car is not one that you want to own. So what's happening a lot at the moment is people, particularly over the last couple of years, there's a shortage of Toyotas. They're buying ex-mines vehicles and painting them all underneath. So everything looks nice and black and tidy in the way it should. But the reality is that has been on a pit and it has been flogged. And so, there's still plenty of people doing interesting things to make a buck.
That is extremely interesting. Yeah, I live on the Goldie, James, so I'm sure that there's plenty of Ferraris driving around there that wouldn't sell very well either, that we hear ripping around the streets down there sometimes. Hey, Scotty's popped a question in just saying, have we seen the bottom in the wholesale passenger vehicle market now?
Rarely do you see the bottom in it in the summer months. I'm a big believer in taking note of the weather, particularly with cars. So I don't think I think we're in as I said, a more normalised market, not a bottom market. Like, it's not blood on the floor just yet. That may happen next year, but I don't see any signs that make me confident to say, yeah, the market's going to be terrible. Hold off, or buy now, or whatever it happens to be. So I think the market is still relatively buoyant. It's just taking some time. It's just not as strong as what we got used to over COVID.
Absolutely.
But clearance rates during just by high level, clearance rates in COVID were upwards of 95%. And now they're sort of back around that sort of 70 to 80 type % mark, depending on what you're selling. So commercials sell really well. So that is your dual cab utes, your single cab utes, 4-wheel drives, those sorts of things where people like them. And they normally spike, those prices spike over the school holidays because people want to go into a road trip, or they want to take kids driving on the beach, or whatever it happens to be. So that is that's one thing. And then things like Toyota Camrys, they're not as popular as they used to because no one wants that. You look at the best-selling cars in the country, and they're all dual cab utes and things that you can go camping with and do whatever. So that action lifestyle is what people want. So I don't think, the long-winded answer is, I don't think we've seen the bottom. I think the market's still pretty good.
And then there we go. There's always a last one that's popped in, so we'll make this the last one. But when we, your thoughts on leisure? So COVID, people are tapping into cash that they had access to, boats, caravans. Not being able to travel and trying to do what they can in Australia. Where do you see that market moving in the next 12 months? Do you think we're going to still see this influx of buying caravans, or do you think people are going to get back on cruises and we're going to have a lot of second-hand vans on the market?
Well, this is just a personal choice, but I wouldn't, unless it's a major brand, I wouldn't buy a caravan that was built in the last 2 years. So we've sold up quite a few caravan manufacturers, particularly on the north side of Melbourne, but elsewhere around the country. And so, there's not a lot that goes in a caravan. And you look at a caravan and go, all right, well, it's built for kind of maybe 150 or 200 nights, depending on whether you use that in 1 year or 10 years. That's kind of, its life. So I think that there will be a bit of a normalising. I think that pre-COVID, the caravans held their values pretty well, to the point that I actually advised my mother and father-in-law just to go and buy a brand new one rather than buy a second-hand one, because it's better value just buying new and then you sell it second-hand. And then COVID happened and they've still got it, so they love it. That's great. But I think that leisure is going to be the one that bites next year. Again, that's one of those ones that I'll watch after Easter. As interest rates start to bite, people will decide what they want to do. They'll use their caravans if fuel prices aren't high, but at the moment they're still a little bit higher, and people will not travel as far. So they might go 100 k's instead of going 500 k's.
Yeah, okay. Ken, I just noticed you just popped your hand up. Did you have a question? No, maybe not. And the reason why I asked that too, James, is obviously, certainly up here in Queensland, lots of super contributions that people could tap into over COVID. People who I know that work in, boat manufacturing, etc., and just couldn't literally produce enough boats. And so I think about that leisure side of the market and wonder whether that's, where that's going to end up. Have you seen many boats?
We sell the most amount of repossessed boats in the middle of winter.
Yeah.
And that's the worst time to sell it, but that's when everyone thinks, oh well, I don't want to pay for my boat because I'm not using it, so that'll be the first asset that goes. So again, a good one to watch, but depending on the right boat, I mean, there's still a lot of people that did really, really, really well out of COVID. And there's a lot of people that are doing tough at the moment, but there's still heaps that are doing pretty well. And so boat sales, I think, will continue. There will still be a market for it. It'll just come down to how well maintained they are. jet skis are always something that you can't remove doubt on. So that's always a bit of a roll of the dice whether you buy one and whether it's good or not. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. That leisure sector is definitely one to watch because that'll be a true gauge of what's happening, particularly through that insolvency repossessed side of the market.
Fantastic. James, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us for our last partnership series webinar of the year. I think it's such an interesting topic, and we've seen some, amazing things happen in the last 2 to 3 years in this space. And, we're glad to partner with you, and I'm excited to have you again next year to talk about, replay some of this for you. Just kidding, and see where your predictions came out. But James Slattery from Slattery Auctions and Valuations, thank you so much for joining us, and happy holiday season. And to all of our viewers today, thanks for taking the time out again. I can see some very familiar names, and we're really grateful that you've given up your time to hear from James today.
It's no drama. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, James. Take care, everyone.
See ya. Bye.